Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Be a great time to make sure your devices are on silent mode. We used to all practice that the minute we walked into a lecture hall, but so for some of us, it's been a while. Welcome, welcome. It's wonderful to have you with us this evening. We love having you at the museum. I'm Catherine Ware, curator of photographs, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Anne Wilkes Tucker, whose lecture is presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, Transgressions and Amplifications, Mixed Media Photography of the 1960s and 1970s. And we hope you will take an opportunity to see the show, probably not tonight, but it is open through January 8th of the new year. I wanted to tell you a little bit about Anne before she comes and takes the podium. She trained as an artist and photographer, and starting in the 1970s, helped shape the field from the perspective of a museum curator at a time when many institutions were just beginning to think of collecting photographs as works of art. Anne studied photographic history with Joan Lyons and Beaumont Newhall in Rochester, New York, before becoming a curatorial intern at the Museum of Modern Art, working with the now legendary curator, John Sharkovsky. She went on to teach photographic history at the New School for Social Research, Cooper Union, and the Philadelphia College of Art. During that time, she began working on a book to examine the role of female photographers in the field. And in 1973, she published The Woman's Eye, a study of 100 photographs created by 10 20th century women photographers, or just artists. Now I've lost my place. The book's texts provide biographical information while raising questions about whether it is possible to locate gender in the authorship of a photograph, and how the artists address prevailing challenges to establish their right to artistic ambition and careers. In 1976, Tucker was recruited by the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, where she went on to establish its photography department and create a world-class collection of more than 30,000, I think it's actually 40,000, photographs. Among her awards and fellowships are a Guggenheim Fellowship granted in 1983. During her significant career at the museum, Tucker organized more than 40 exhibitions, published 24 books, and traveled widely to research and define the scope of this global medium. She often worked in collaboration with other curators. Her exhibitions and publications covered broad topics ranging from contemporary photography in the United States, Korea, and Argentina, as well as large compendiums on the history of Japanese photography, to a global study of photographs of war and its aftermath. Her monographic surveys include work by photographers Brassai, Mark Klett, Robert Frank, Ray K. Metzger, Richard Mizrak, Milagros de la Torre, and Catherine Wagner. She retired from the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in 2015 and continues to be a defining voice in the field. As a longtime colleague of Anne's, I would also like to acknowledge her leadership in defining what it means to be a curator of photographs. She blazed a trail and then set standards that many of us adopted. She has been generous with her time and candid about the challenges and rewards of the work that we do. Thank you, Anne, for your dedication, rigor, support, and humor. And I look forward to your talk this evening. Please welcome Anne Tucker.
Well, thank you all for coming out on a Friday night, and I know there is at least one person here that is a fan of the Houston Astros, so particularly thank to you. especially with Chamber pitching, right? But other than that, I really want to thank you for turning out. This is a bit of a stretch for me, so I hope you like it. Kate Ware shaped this lecture in her kindness to recognize that next year, the 50th anniversary of The Woman's Eye, this year, this is not only the 50th anniversary of my book, but just over 50 years since the incredible decade in which the second wave of feminism raved. Kate also requested that I relate my presentations to the thoughtful and stimulating exhibition now on view in the New Mexico Museum of Art, Transgressions and Amplifications, Mixed Media. Therefore, I sought to link the two projects that were created 50 years apart. One link is that Bea Nettles is featured in my book, and she is well represented in the current exhibition. But more important, in the early 70s, there was an abundant discussion in identifying and describing a dominant dichotomy in process, style, and aesthetic intention in the photographic community. Thus, here is a brief attempt, at least I hope it's brief, to present various views of that dichotomy, and then an in-depth focus on the work primarily made in the 70s of three women who focused their creative thought into self-published books, and whose work arose distinctly in a complex mix of both sides of that dichotomy: Joan Lyons, Bea Nettles, and Marsha Resnick. In 1976, I wrote a catalog text for my first exhibition as a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. We received funds from the Target collection to purchase 70 20th century photographs, 14 of which were by women and 2 by African American men. I divided the photographs into categories, similar to a stance that John Sarkovsky would take 2 years later. The text below is an abbreviated description of my own perceptions of those two dominant photographic aesthetics at the time. I wrote, "Photographers who are intrigued by the physical universe are more attentive to the look of, rather than how they feel about, the subject of a photograph. When the photographer's presence does not overly intervene, the viewer can meditate on the photograph as though looking at the subject through a window. The photographer's talent is to recognize content in appearances, the formal elegance of a starched collar, the poverty or the negligence of a holey sock. Another group of photographers are not committed to what they find, but to what they remember or imagine or feel. They are disciplined by the look of the art itself, not its subject matter, and the medium, often the visceral, earthly pleasures of work with graphic materials. They disdain the photograph as evidence of anything other than the actualization of their own vision. Their images are suggestive rather than explicit, and are indebted to other arts as much as to the literal reality." In 1978, John Sarkovsky, then director of the photography department at the Museum of Modern Art, turned to the clarity of sight through windows as a metaphor to describe photographs through which the exterior world is explored in all its presence and reality. Alternatively, Sarkovsky chose mirrors as a symbol of capturing a romantic expression of the photographer's sensibility as it projects itself on the things and sights of the world. He described photographs he classified as mirrors as initiating a shift in photography from public to private concerns. The title of Sarkovsky's exhibition was Mirrors and Windows, American Photography Since 1960. Despite his own protests to the contrary, his preference was for photographs that were windows. He framed windows in white metal frames and the mirrors in black. at the time evoking discussions of potential symbolism of his choice in the color of frames. Van Deren Koch actually used the terms white hat and black hat. I'm grateful to Kate Ware and other members of the New Mexico Museum of Art for this invitation to speak on the occasion of this exhibition. This show also focuses on photographs from the 60s and 70s, whose photographic images are in the museum's collection by artists seized by the freedom to reimagine photography, by turning antique photo processes, other arts and craft practices, and new imaging technologies to make pictures that were faithful to unseen thoughts, memories, and emotions, rather to the visual reality. Sarkovsky attributed that shift away from what he defined as public concerns, in part, to the decline of the great picture magazines and that impact on photographic professionals, particularly journalists. The text in Transgressions and Amplifications attributed these aesthetic shifts to the social unrest of the Vietnam conflict and justice movements, with desired change for the status quo in life and art. I take a broader view and assign this dichotomy of addressing either physical reality or inner visions to the earliest years of photography. For that instance, the dramatically different photographs of Peter Henry Emerson and Henry Peach Robinson. I only realized recently how close my selections of the specific women on the Women's Eye are those selected in 1984 by Beaumont Newhall for his book on the history of photography, 8 out of the 10 I selected, and by Sarkovsky's selection for looking at photographs, also published in 1973 with 100 brilliant essays, choosing 7. I chose 7 out of the 14 in his collection. The structure of The Woman's Eye sets 5 of the 10 photographers in this book as working from personal vision, and 5 working within a cooler commitment to the physical world, with nothing but admiration for each group of women. As most of them are well known, I won't discuss their careers for the sake of brevity, but I have included their portraits and self-portraits for your revelation. This may be my favorite pair. Here's Gertrude Kaiser, a well-known portrait photographer dressed in her best and photographed by Edward Steichen, and Frances Benjamin Johnson with her skirt hiked, a beer mug in her hand and a cigarette in the other hand. But it's Kaiser who is the one who is constructing photographs. We don't know if this young woman is indeed a World War I war widow, or someone, a model that Kaiser has hired, which she often did to create photographs. I didn't choose some of the most famous photographs by Frances Johnson, such as the extraordinary picture she made of the Tuskegee Institute, because I fell in love with this woman whose expression is, so now what? Now, it might surprise many of you that Margaret Burke White is in my column of somebody who manipulated the photographs, whereas Dorothea Lange did not. The project for which she most regrettably manipulated the photographs was the book that she did with her then husband, Erskine Caldwell, called You Have Seen Their Faces. They went in with a decision about what the book was going to be about. And they didn't use actual location names, and Kirsten wrote the quotes like this one: I've done the best I knew all my life, but it didn't amount to much in the end, for this woman's portrait. Now, I have personal reasons for doubting that, which is that my mother was born in a home without water or electricity, but they were not sharecroppers. They owned their own property. They picked cotton, they grew watermelon, they did what they needed to do. All 3 kids went to college. But they dressed like this. I looked through all the books of the FSA years, and I only found 21 photographs where the woman had on jewelry, like this woman. She's not a sharecropper. She is probably, like my family, owned her own property. And that lace collar is something that the woman would have made. The dress is nice. Think of the dresses in Walker Evans's book. You have seen their faces. Tears, fratters. So that description of this woman angers me. Lang, I love this quote by Willard Van Dyke. For Lang, making a shot is an adventure that begins with no planned itinerary. Lang met the people. When she could, she talked to them. We all know the exception to that with a migrant mother, but most of the time she did that. Bernice Abbott, Barbara Morgan. Bernice was, I don't know exactly what age, 23, she was born 89, you can do the math. But she's just left Ohio, cut her hair. The first thing she did when she got to New York was bob her hair. She lived in New York for a while. She then moved to Paris. Barbara Morgan was married to Willard Morgan. They lived next door to Beaumont and Nancy Newhall. They were established members of the photographic community. Barbara was a painter as well as a photographer, so her idea of photographic purity was not existence in her time frame normally. I'm making an exception in the picture I chose. But don't you love this picture of Willard holding his wife with this rope to keep her from falling off the cliff as she draws whatever she's drawing? That's trust. Bernice quickly joined the lesbian community of Paris. Sylvia Beach, the founder of the famous Shakespeare bookstore, many other extraordinary women. When Bernice had a show at the Museum of Modern Art, I've always meant to go and look up the invitation list because the vibes in that room were so powerful from these women that arrived from Paris to congratulate Bernice. I've always been dying to know who was there, what great writers were there that night. And she was an extraordinary portraitist, and then she went on to photograph architecture. She was a pivotal windows person by Sarkovsky. Barbara made straight photographs. She also made light drawings. She made double exposure. She was in that other field. Now, I've chosen this portrait of Nancy Newhall for a very direct reason, which is she is one of the brightest women writers we have in this medium, and one of the most disrespected by the male professionals in photography. The way they dished her, the way they treated her as only Beaumont's wife, the way they treated her as somebody who did not act independently. I was there to see in Rochester. It was not right, but it was common. If you ever want to read something interesting, she wrote one of the first issues. She was a founder of Aperture, and she wrote one of the first essays in the first issue of Aperture. Diane Arbus, I don't have to introduce, I don't think anybody here. I happened to study in her class. It was fascinating. But if you want to know somebody who wants details, she really hollowed out a photographer who held up a picture, and she got furious when he couldn't say what street corner he had made that picture on. Elisa Wells has, talking about mirrors, I think there are 4 of them here, or 5. You can't see her face. She is hidden. And Arbus is his classic, one of the ones that were in her portfolio of 10. What Alicia did at this time was she found these 19th century, early 20th century negatives, and then she altered them in solarization and other ways. which absolutely infuriated Lee Friedlander, who wanted her to not do that. She was burning those negatives, and what right did she have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The last two were Judy Dater and Bea Nettles. Judy was doing a series of portraits of women. There is a sexuality of whatever flavor you want in these pictures, but they are so sexuality is part of all the images. This was the cover of my book. I want to go back a minute to this portrait of Bea, and then this one of Bea from the book, from the essay, the photographic essay that were the 11 photographs in the woman's eye. But for Bea, this picture of her against this plastic shower curtain with the birds imprisoned was part of what she was getting at in this series, this book, Escape, which I will return to in a minute. Okay. At the same time, my book, The Woman's Eye, was a teeny little part of the beginning of the second wave of feminism. And of course, the classic book, which is regarded genuinely as the initiating book, was The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And Friedan, the point of Friedan's book was that fulfillment as a woman had only one definition for American women after 1949, and that was as housewife and mother. At the same time this came out, and millions of copies were sold around the world. Gloria Steinem and then Dorothy Pitman founded Ms. Magazine. And I'm not going to read all of these, but this was one of the most educational pages for me to put together for. I've highlighted Linda Laughlin's Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, because that essay, which has also just been the 50th anniversary of it, engendered more response from women writers. It was the beginning of the art history for women artists in the history of art. And these are all court cases and laws. I'm just going to read a few of them. First of all, I'll mention the Women's Strike for Peace and Equality in New York. 50,000 people marched down Fifth Avenue. I was one of them. And I, like many other people, the women that started that march were screaming at us, join us, join us. And I was working at the Monitor at the time. I got out of my office chair and went and joined them. Women on Fifth Avenue were leaning out of windows and came down and joined them. It ended up at Central Park. It was an extraordinary feeling. The part that was a little bit disturbing, and I'm probably one of the only people that noticed it, is Gary Winogrand, Lee Friedlander, Todd Papageorge, and Jay DeFeo. Not Jay DeFeo, I have brain freeze. Anyway, him. They were there zeroing in on the women in the parade like hunters after birds. I've always wanted to ask one of them what they did with those negatives. They are something that should be had, but as a woman watching them, knowing who they were, it was really disturbing because they got really close. They got really close and were photographed. It was aggressive. Okay, I'm just going to mention a few of these. Women's studies started in that decade. The Supreme Court ruled that sexual discrimination was a violation of the Fourth Amendment. The passage of Title IX to forbid sex discrimination education. We wouldn't have women's sports in universities if it weren't for Title IX. This legalization of abortion, the Fair Housing Act, which was amended to prohibit discrimination based on sex, along with race, color, religion, and national origin, ruling that women could and must be allowed to serve on juries. So these are just, I was just really surprised at the congestion of this extraordinary rulings that came, and I was a little disconcerted by these last two things. The Susan B. Anthony dollar only existed for 2 years because there was poor public acceptance. The second one was even more disconcerting, which I remembered well, thank you Phyllis Schlafly, was that the ERA amendment did not get the 3 votes it needed to be added to the Constitution. So this decade started with this extraordinary focus of women's rights and ended with the denying of the ERA. Okay, I chose to pick 3 women who made artist books, and I chose them because at that time there were so few galleries, magazines, anything that wrote about or exhibited museums, women artists. So like these 3 women, many women turned to self-published books as a way to get their art out into some kind of a community. But they also both published very important books in the field. Joan was the editor of the Visual Studies Workshop Press. She and Nathan were the founders of the VSW, and she before she retired, she oversaw the production of 450 artist books at the VSW Press. She herself published, I think, 30, I've forgotten that number. But this book has been in and out of print, as has Bea's book on alternative media photography. So that these women, what I like about these books is that they not only worked for themselves, but they knew their communities and they did things that were positive for their communities. Okay, I'm just going to read you this extraordinary statement by Joan Lyons because I think it's the best relatively short description of what an artist book is. Over the last 20 years, visual artists, increasingly concerned with the time-based media, have discovered the book, investigating and transforming every aspect of that vernacular container of the written word. They have manipulated page, format, and content, sometimes subtly, sometimes turning the book into a reflective discussion of its own tradition. They have illustrated real-time in simple flip books or collaged real-time in active time. They have disguised artist books as traditional books and made others that are scarcely recognizable. The best of the book works are multi-notational. Within them, words, images, colors, marks, and even silences become plastic organisms that play across the pages with variable linear sequence. Their importance lies in the formulation of a new perceptual literature whose content alters the concept of authorship and challenges the reader to a new discourse with the printed page. Now, the 3 women whose images and books are going to be discussed here were attracted to books, as I've mentioned, because they could get their work out there. Lyons used the Visual Studies Workshop, which she co-founded, and she directed for 30 years. Nettles used the Visual Studies Workshop at first, and later her own Inky Press Productions. Marcia self-published her books without a title. I have chosen to use their own words, not mine, to discuss their work in aesthetics, which is actually something I've been doing for about 10 years now. I stopped writing articles for photographers' books and interviewed them instead, so that their words talked about their work instead of mine. Joan Lyons. Okay, I should also say I've known all these women for 50 years. They are all friends. And Bea was my student briefly, and she was smarter than I was anyway. One of Joan's first books is this one, Selfimpressions. In it, Joan worked, these are Xerox, haloid process which Xerox invented. It only existed for a short time, but Xerox gave Joan the machine, and she worked on this process for 10 years. But she said, I have used the body in a number of different ways. In some early works, it was often my own body, and there was a deliberate attempt not to objectify women, but to internalize their representation. I was questioning some aspects of the photographic portrait, working in opposition to an instantaneous snapshot or a decisive moment. Each image was a composite that took a better part of a day to photograph. All right, now this is an early example of when she first started using with that machine, and they are a self-portrait by Joan and a portrait by Nathan, and that slice is not a mistake. That is where the machine, where something got wiped. Now look at how complex the images got when she got really familiar with that machine. So where she's actually applying drawing to the original photograph, or in Nathan's case, for the Nathan portrait, it's multiple exposures. The next project that I adore is the Artifacts portfolio. Joan had the coat is one of her kids, one of the boys had this Japanese jacket, which is extraordinary. And it might well, I've never asked, it might well have been something. Nathan was stationed in Korea, so it might have been something Nathan had, I don't know. The other is Joan always loved fabrics. Both Joan and Bea started sewing at an early age. Both of them collected fabrics. Both of them used fabrics and stitching in their art. As Joan says here, that she had sewed as a child throughout her life. But when she took these, when she made this portfolio, she photographed them, and then she made offset lithographs. And this is her printer's apron. And this is her daughter Beth's newspaper delivery bag. And I love this quote: "Pop art isolated objects, but my archives were not soup cans, but the fabric of my life." And that is a theme that flows through all of their works, that they were dealing with their lives and other women's lives. This is also one of my favorite quotes. This is Joan's daughter's prom dress, and Joan talks about, on top of running the workshop, on top of raising 3 kids, because Beth is the oldest, on top of cooking for Nathan and all his house guests and whatever else she had to do, Joan wanted her mother to make the prom dress, so she did it. And Beth wanted to make it, and it was very traditional. And then at the end of the prom, what happens to the prom dress? So this piece took guts to make, said Joan. It contradicted everything. I'd been taught that art should be abstract, universal, and non-representational. This was personal, concrete, suspiciously narrative, and worst of all, pastel. Okay. Then a book that I had not known about until recently, which was a collaboration between Joan and a poet friend of hers, Juliet McGrath, and it is the OnetoOne Book. And Joan's quote is, "I was an angry woman. I had to grow up raising 3 small children with photographers in the house complaining that they had to work 2 days a week." But that's not my favorite quote. My favorite quote from Joan is their round kitchen table. I sat at that kitchen table. Hundreds of photographers and photography people have sat at that kitchen table, and often the discussion went on late. And Joan talks about one night, she was tired. She knew the children weren't going to wake early. She came down the stairs. Now, their bedroom was over the kitchen table, over the kitchen. She sort of waved at Nathan and, did whatever she needed to do to say, okay, you can make them go away now. At 2 o'clock, when they were still there, she started vacuuming under their feet. That a girl. And so here comes Wonder Woman. where she morphs. This book is a bit darker. And in this quote, Joan says, "My work has been about locating myself as a woman within my culture and locating my art practice within the history of art making." She says many times that her work is not autobiographical. But if you look at this book, which is a flip book, and it starts with a traditional wedding portrait, and then, as Joan says, first photograph, bride in white, last photograph, negative image of the bride. Things were not always rosy. This book, on the other hand, is a dear to read. I mean, I think they're still available if any of you are quilters. It's a wonderful book. It was every text, all the texts in this are one letter from a grandmother to her granddaughter, written in 2025, and given to her granddaughter with a silk patchwork quilt made by the author's mother. And Joan says, in the early years before the personal was political, became a mantra, I felt as though I was really out on the limb, dealing with subject matter that we could now call feminist. I was not part of the Women's Network. I would later become more aware, intuitively reaching for issues that were both difficult and important to me. I struggled with how appropriately to use personal experience as an art project. I was not interested in self-revelation, but in making note of a common experience. So she thinks that, and I don't remember how many generations this Elsa is down from the woman who wrote the letter, and her mother who allowed Joan to put this letter into the book. All of these marvelous components of a quilt that were made but never sewed in. This collection belongs to Stephanie Cole and the photographer, Nathan Friedan. I can't add the dean. Sorry, David. Okay, this book is hysterical. Now, most everything is 70s, but I couldn't. Joan said, you got to put the gynecologist in, and she's right. Okay. Fanciful, historical, gynecological representations of women are juxtaposed with a contemporary patient-doctor interview, which reveals the authority a traditionally male medical culture holds in describing and prescribing for an individual body, in this case, female. Aspects of this text will be familiar to most women. I don't know if this book is still available. I think it sold pretty quickly. And then this final one is quite touching. It is a book dedicated to her mother, with whom she had, as you will hear, a very, very complicated relationship. My mother, Ida Fishman, was born in a shtetl near Odessa on the 4th of July. In 1906, or maybe 1904, when she was 7 or 8 or 5, Hansa Goldman, newly named Ida Hoffman by a clerk at Ellis Island when she arrived in the New World. And at the end, and so here the picture on the far left is her when she's still in Odessa. Then that is a late picture of her mother, and this is a middle-aged picture of her mother. This book begins with my grandmother's dream and ends with mine. The stories and pictures which form its contents are only a sense particular to one family and one set of circumstances. What interests me is what is remembered and how, as it passed along. My mother hated her mother's hard life and wanted another, as I hated my mother's life and wanted another. This book is dedicated for her memory and her generations. Okay, Miss Nettles. Bea and I are close to the same age. I think she's a year younger than I am. I began acquiring her work early. this piece you see of the Swan Dream is in the Museum of Fine Arts collection. This extraordinary piece is in the exhibition here, and I really recommend that you go look at it, because in seeing all the reproductions, I didn't realize that that image of Bea sets off from the image. So it's a three-dimensional thing. And I mentioned that both of these pieces involve stitching, which, because both Bea and Joan were sewers from early age, a component of that. Then both of them pretty much turned to books in the 70s. And this book, called Flora Fantasies, was the first book I ever saw of Bea's. I saw it at Light Gallery, and I considered it for my book, The Woman's Eye. Bea and I were both young and finding our way in the art world. I wanted a photographer who worked in sequences, and I liked that Bea used a low-tech plastic camera for the 21 images in this book, Flora Fantasies. Bea and I were both given snapshot cameras when we were in adolescence. And by the way, my first degree, I have a photographer's degree. I never got a degree as an art historian. When I offered to include Bea's work in The Woman's Eye, she suggested her second book, Escape, which she felt had more feminist sequence. So these are images from Florida Fantasy, and then we'll get to Escape in a minute. But her mother, Grace Nettles, raised 5 children, and she was extremely close to her mother, as Joan was not to her mother. Grace Nettles raised 5 children, then she attained an MA in English and taught poetry at a community college for 2 decades. Bea and her mother collaborated on 3 books, Imaginary Blowtards in 73, The Elsewhere Bird in 74, Blossom Love in 75, and then Bea did a posthumous edition, a book in 2007, to bring more of her mother's poetry to the public. I love this portrait of Bea. Here is somebody who is committed to fantasy, and she's got these Coke bottle caps in her eyes with the light shining on them. It's such an early picture. It is to be folded into her work throughout. With each new material and process, Bea taught herself as a need. She learned offset printing by going to a printer and having them teach it to her. She learned all these processes herself. Through them, she wrote, I was investigating and sharing myself, my life and landscape that is around and within me. Family ties, 20 years spent on the green and growth of Florida, and the dreams that I remember every morning are the elements of my work. In her 1979 book, Flamingo in the Dark, Bea wrote that a drawing made when she was in grade school contained the seeds of her mature work: plants, an exotic bird, moonlight, water reflections, and the Florida night air. Now the next book, Escape, is the one that's in The Woman's Eye. And Bea had just gotten a job at Tyler School of Art, and she had moved to Philadelphia, which was the largest city she had ever lived in. The book, Escape, deals metaphorically with many different kinds of escapes, but Philadelphia was very alien, big city experience for Bea. A woman was mugged outside of this apartment building, and so she began to escape, became part of her dreams. And there are pictures of Bea daydreaming with birds. Then she moved to a smaller town with a smaller house and a yard, and then went home to regenerate herself from her early negative experiences in downtown Philadelphia. Now, one of the things that I love about Bea was she made these books. She learned offset. She made these books, and then she wanted to protect them. So she started buying shower curtains and cutting them up and stitching them together and using them as the folders to put around her books. And then Elsewhere Bird, one of the books with her mother, is the first use of translucent overlay. So she began to learn how to do printing on very difficult kinds of surfaces. This is a book she made for her children. This is a book that her youngest of the 5 children made when she was 13, and it's a creation myth. And Bea designed the book using offset press and screen printing on Mylar. This image, which is a cover of one of her books, said, "I chose models who suited me." But this is, all right, I should read this other one first. "The idea arrived in a dream. The decision to assemble a book, a photo set of tarot cards, was made in my sleep. I began the next morning choosing models and locations. While I was at Penland School, later I continued with new models in Philadelphia while teaching at Tyler School of Art." This tarot card went into 3 printings. It was, and now the first printing, if you're lucky, is selling at $3,000. But here, I'm going to come back to this picture, but it says, "I chose models who suited the cards and reused models as well as myself and my family. This portrait is from the same photo shoot that was eventually used for the Queen of Pentacles, which is one of the sections of the tarot. Evening, this picture, alludes to the sky goddess Nut, whom the Egyptians believe came each night as a woman whose body was covered with stars. She lowered herself over the earth at night and raised it up in the morning." The tarot cards fascinated me, she wrote, as a highly complex collection of visual information. It's very old, perhaps beginning in ancient Egypt. Its symbolism and imagery could make a lifelong study. I based my imagery on the classical pictorial key to the tarot by Waite. My cards were intuitive, not literal interpretations of the ancient decks. I chose models who suited the cards. Minimal costumes. Some were very elaborate and some were jeans and t-shirts. And this is the back. All the stars is the back of the cards. In the tarot, there were 22 cards in the upper arcana and the section, and 14 cards in each of the 4 decks: swords, wands, pentacles, and cups. Bea reused models and negatives. The woman on the sofa that you saw in Shangrim's, you see used again here. So it wasn't, Bea is the most alien to Sarkovsky's idea of a proper photograph. She is bending every rule. She is using fantasy. Marsha Resnick is the furthest step from either of the other 2 women. I have these books of hers, Landscape, Loftscape, Tahiti, Sea, and Revision, and they're all made in a 3-year period. Landscape, Loftscape. So this is where she photographed outside, and then she reconstructed it in her studio. So this is Landscape, Loftscape. Bea had studied at Columbia University, and by the way, in high school, she was second in her class. First was Chuck Schumer. She studied briefly at Columbia University, then at Cooper Union, where I taught photo history, but I'm not sure I taught her anything. She also learned sequencing from the filmmaker Hollis Rampton, and she then received her MFA in California, where she studied with conceptual art with John Baldessari and was introduced to happenings by Alan Capro. She was also taken by the books of Ed Roche. All right. So here we have tires and donuts. Beauty does not have to be traditional, said Bea, and more, especially in New York, where everything is kind of ugly. You seek new ways of comprehending beauty. It is necessary to survive. And here is one of my favorites, which is a real drive-in, and then that's Marsha with toy cars in the studio construction. Baldessari opened up the concept that I could control situations because I was making photographs. Art was bigger than just the particular categories like painting and sculpture. You could go out of those categories and make new art. This series was harder initially for me to embrace, but the more I read about it, the more critical reviews I understood more. The photographs of C were made 74, 75, and eventually became her first self-published art book. Posting herself the same distance from each subject, she photographed each public person from behind as they gazed at a landscape that became increasingly open as the series evolved. The last image in this series is the photographer James Welling standing over the Grand Canyon. Resnick became conscious of her body as well as her subject's body in space by ideas influenced by reading the works of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Again, evolving concepts that are part of a large world art world discussion. So Marsha was the only one of those three people who really was in the contemporary art world. She lived in New York. She went to exhibitions. She went to galleries. She had studied with the major figures, Baldessari, Capello, Hollis Frampton. She was really part of that. On a very interesting review that I read, the recent contemporary review, she was written up in the New Yorker and several other art news, really interesting article in Art News, said, why weren't you identified as part of the picture generation? You know, Cindy Sherman and all those. And she said, I've asked that question myself. Then this one, landscape, was really hard for me at first until I found this quote. Deadpan humor is key to Resnick's works. In her landscape series from 1974, she presented photographs of empty skies and latent horizons that intentionally lack much interest by way of a subject. It's a send-up to the texturally rich, large-scale outdoor photographs of the likes of Ansel Adams. I wanted to do landscapes which were anti-theoretical to Ansel Adams, Resnick said. Tahiti, another book, was where she went to Tahiti. Boy, would you like to go to Tahiti to make a book about that, Dick? Where she posed models who were posed by Gauguin in these awkward positions. She reflected the Gauguin's throughout the book. She also went to a few nighttime beach parties, I think. Okay. The book that made her reputation was this book, Revision. And it produced a series of photographs that are reconstructions of memories in her early life, humorous and images about female. And I'm not going to say anything but to read this caption that I'm reading is written under the picture. She painted racing strips on her hula hoop in hopes that it would go faster. She became an expert shoplifter. She secretly lusted for her television idols. She placed fake teeth under her pillow. She would collect extra money from the tooth fairy. I hope this presentation, which has been a bit dense and a little long, has offered some insights into photography, as well as the lives and art of these three women artists in the 70s. It was an education for me to reassess that time and realize what a cusp the 70s were to radical change in photography in relation to the general art world, as well as to the fight for women's rights, which seemed to be ever ongoing. It is also interesting that both Bea Nettles and Marsha Resnick have only recently received monographic reviews and retrospectives. of their careers and artistic work. Now we just need a monograph by Joan Lyons. I thank you for your attendance and your attention.